The wind didn't howl that day. It whispered, low and cold, the kind of chill that slipped down spines and made good folks turn their collars and mind their own business. Samuel Cridge rode into Cold Creek the way he always did, quiet, slow, and with more dust than pride clinging to his boots. He hadn't spoken more than a few words all week, and he liked it that way. Silence didn't judge. Silence didn't ask about the grave under the cottonwood tree or the debt sealed with red ink on his barn door, but silence broke that day. He had just tied his horse outside the general store when he noticed the gathering behind the saloon, not large, but tense like flies drawn to something already starting to rot. No music, no auction bell, just murmurs, eyes flicking toward the alley and then away, quick and guilty. Curiosity wasn't a virtue. He knew better than to poke his nose where it didn't belong, but still he walked. Behind the saloon, amid broken crates and rusted spittoons, a girl stood, not crying. That would have been easier. Her dress was plain, patched and muddy. One hand rested on her belly, swollen and firm. The other hung limp. Blonde hair, tangled by the wind, framed a face far too pale for summer. Two men stood beside her, hard-jawed, mean-eyed, the kind of men who chewed tobacco and talked behind closed fists. One of them looked Samuel up and down and sneered like he smelled something weak. "She don't look like much," he muttered to a fat merchant who stood nearby, "but she's healthy, strong hips, child's almost due, could be of use if you got hands need warming." Someone chuckled. Someone else spat. Samuel said nothing. His jaw tightened. The girl didn't look up, just stared at the ground like maybe if she stayed still long enough, she could disappear. Her hands were tied at the front, rough rope, not meant for livestock. "She's kin," the other man explained casually. "Brother's wife. He passed, left us with nothing but her and the debt. We're settling accounts." "No preacher here," someone muttered. Samuel took one step forward. It was enough to draw their eyes. "You looking to buy, stranger?" one of the men asked, with a grin that didn't touch his eyes. The girl looked up just once, their eyes locked, not pleading, not desperate, just hollow, the kind of hollow that came when the world took and never gave back. "No," Samuel said, "just looking." But he wasn't. There were stories written into her silence. Shame, defiance, maybe even a flicker of rage buried so deep she'd forgotten the shape of it. Something twisted in his chest. He remembered the weight of a child too small to live, buried beside the woman who'd once carried her. That pain never healed. Not really. And somehow, this girl's stillness pressed against it like a bruise. The man laughed. "She ain't gonna protest. Never had much fight in her." The girl blinked, just once. A storm gathered behind her eyes. "How much?" Samuel asked. Everything stopped. The bearded one squinted. "You serious?" Samuel nodded once, a pause, a smirk. $50, and a rifle. Samuel didn't hesitate. He reached inside his coat and tossed a pouch of coins on the barrel. Then slowly, deliberately, he unhooked the old Winchester from his back. You're a damn fool," someone muttered. The man snatched the rifle like it was gold. "She's yours." Samuel didn't move. "What's her name?" "Don't matter." He turned to the girl. Her lips cracked open. "Eleanor," she said softly. "Eleanor Dumont." And that was when everything changed. Not the sale, not the silence, but a name and a voice turned her from object to person. He offered his hand. She didn't take it, but she stepped toward him. That was enough. They left Cold Creek in silence, not the peaceful kind, but the brittle hush of two people who'd survived something unspeakable. Samuel didn't speak as he guided the mule west, out of the dust-choked town. The girl, Eleanor, sat in the wagon bed, hands still bound with rope that he hadn't yet dared to untie. Not because he didn't trust her, but because she hadn't asked. She hadn't said a word since she spoke her name, and Samuel was not a man to push. The sun dipped low. The sky burned orange and then slipped into blue. By the time they reached the riverbank, the stars had begun to blink open like shy children. He built a small fire. Not much, just enough warmth to fight the cold that clung to her shoulders like sorrow. He shrugged off his coat and offered it. She hesitated, then took it wordlessly. Her movements were slow, careful, like every gesture cost her something. I got some bread, he said, unwrapping a cloth from his saddlebag. Jerky, too. It's not much, but it's yours. She didn't look at him when she took it, but her fingers trembled. They sat in silence. The river moved beside them, quiet, steady, like it knew better than to interrupt. He didn't stare, just watched the flames curl and snap. You don't owe me anything, he said after a while. Still, she said nothing. She stared into the fire like it might answer something. A long pause passed between them, not uncomfortable, just uncertain. My wife's buried under a cottonwood tree, he said quietly, eyes fixed on the sparks. Name was Miriam. She died after our baby girl came too early. No response, but she glanced at him. Barely. He went on. Buried them both in the same week. Thought maybe the land would take the grief, bury it with them, but it never does. You carry it like dust in your coat seams. Never really comes out. For the first time, her posture changed. Her arms curled protectively over her belly. A reflex. Not fear, something more ancient. He noticed. You cold? He asked. She shook her head, but her shoulders were still trembling. The fire crackled. The wind shifted. Then quietly, barely above a breath, she said, They tied my hands so I wouldn't run. He looked at her, slow and steady. Do you want to? She didn't answer, but her eyes met his, and this time they didn't flinch. A long silence stretched. Then she said, almost to herself, They said I was bad luck, that I brought sickness. My husband, he wasn't cruel, just tired. He died before the child came. Samuel didn't interrupt. He let her speak, not because he was kind, but because he knew what it meant to carry stories too long in silence. They wanted to sell me before the baby came. Said it was a mercy. One less mouth to feed. Samuel looked back at the fire. They were wrong. She closed her eyes, and then, like a crack in the wall, she whispered, I didn't think anyone would say that. He didn't reply. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small folding knife, and with careful hands cut the rope from her wrists. She didn't cry. She didn't thank him. But she flexed her fingers slowly, like she was learning them again. When she spoke next, it was barely a whisper. My name is Eleanor, she said. You already told me that. He replied gently. I know, she said, but this time I wanted to say it. He nodded once. The fire danced between them, and in that quiet space something began to take root. Not trust, not yet, but something smaller, like a seed. By midday, they reached the edge of Samuel's land. It wasn't much, just a stretch of dry earth that held on like it had something to prove. The cabin sat crooked on the edge of the ridge, leaning slightly like an old man listening for secrets. One shutter hung by a single hinge. The porch creaked when the wind hit it right. But the door held. The roof didn't leak when the rain stayed soft. To Samuel, it was enough. To Eleanor, it was unknown. He stopped the wagon just shy of the porch and turned to her. We're here. She said nothing. Just wrapped the coat tighter around herself and stepped down slowly, one hand always resting on her belly like a tether to something that might float away. I'll show you inside, he offered. She followed without protest. The interior was spare, wooden walls aged by winters, a small table, 2 chairs, a pot-bellied stove with a cracked iron door. There was a single room off to the side. The bed inside was narrow, the mattress lumpy. A handmade quilt lay folded at the foot, patched in shades of red, brown, and faded blue. My wife made that, he said before he could stop himself. Eleanor didn't respond. She ran her hand along the edge of the quilt like she expected it to bite. Then, slowly, she sat on the edge of the bed, boots still on, back straight as a fence post. I can take the barn, Samuel said. You rest. She shook her head. I'm not helpless. I know. He stood there a moment longer, unsure of what to do with his hands. Then he turned and walked out. Outside, the wind carried the sharp scent of cedar and old dust. He chopped wood until his arms burned, not because they needed it, but because there were too many thoughts in his head and nowhere to put them. Inside, Eleanor moved like a shadow. She washed at the basin he left her, brushed her hair with fingers that still trembled, ate slowly, as if chewing required memory. She folded the quilt down to her waist before lying back, staring at the ceiling, hands laced under her belly. That night, the sky burned with stars. Samuel sat at the porch's edge, an old knife in one hand, whittling a piece of wood into nothing. He wasn't thinking of shapes, just moving, just staying still without drifting. The door opened behind him. Eleanor stepped out, wrapped in a shawl too thin for the cold. Her braid hung loose. She stood there a moment, then sat on the opposite end of the porch. They didn't speak for a long while. Then she said, "It doesn't feel real." He looked up, surprised by her voice. "This place," she added, "the quiet, the not being watched." "It's real," he said. "Take some time to believe it." "I used to hum," she said, so softly he nearly missed it. "When I was a girl. I haven't in a long time." "Maybe you will again." She didn't answer. But the wind shifted, and for the briefest second, he thought he heard it. The memory of a hum, a note that didn't quite form, like the echo of a life that hadn't yet returned, but was circling its way back. He didn't turn, didn't look at her, just let it exist between them, delicate, almost sacred. When she finally stood to go inside, she paused by the door. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, still whittling, still quiet. Because in that moment, words weren't needed. And in silence, something was beginning to heal. The days began to slip into a rhythm, not quite routine, but something like it. Eleanor didn't speak much, and Samuel didn't press. He rose before the sun, chopped wood, checked the fences, tended the mule. She stayed mostly near the cabin, moving with the deliberate care of someone still expecting to be punished for being seen. One morning, he found a tin cup of coffee waiting for him on the porch railing. She was inside, folding linens in silence. He didn't say a word, just picked up the cup, sipped, and nodded once through the open door. That evening, as the fire cracked in the stove and the wind scraped low across the hills, she spoke again. "I planted something." He looked up from the table where he was oiling his saddle straps. "What kind?" "Tomatoes," she said, "and lavender." He blinked. "You did that today?" She nodded. "By the fence." He let out a slow breath. "Good soil there." She gave the faintest curve of a smile, not quite on her lips, more like in her eyes. Then she turned away, sat by the fire, and sewed small stitches into a scrap of flannel. Samuel watched her fingers, steady now, threading old cloth into new shape. That night, she didn't return to the bedroom right away. Instead, she stood on the porch, holding her shawl closed, humming low under her breath. It was broken, halting, but it was music nonetheless. Samuel didn't move from where he sat inside, just closed his eyes and listened, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in the house. A few days later, she asked if she could ride with him to town. Samuel paused, mid-saddle. "You sure? I want to see something besides these four walls," she said. He nodded. She wore her late husband's old hat low, her old dress stretched tight across her belly. Her boots didn't match, but she walked into the general store like a woman trying to remember who she was before someone else rewrote her name. Mrs. Dinger, the storekeeper's wife, raised an eyebrow. "You look well, dear." Eleanor met her eyes. "I feel well." They bought flour, beans, a bolt of cheap blue ribbon. When Samuel asked about it, Eleanor said nothing, but that night, she tied it around her braid and stared at herself in the mirror. Not with vanity, with recognition. The next morning, she laid out clothes for the baby. Handmade, rough, uneven, but soft. She had stitched them from scraps of curtain and old flannel shirts, sewn late into the evenings by the fire. Samuel found her on the porch, gently folding them, humming again. He said nothing, just watched from the field, one boot in the stirrup, his mule shifting beneath him, the sight of her, not just surviving, but standing there, solid in herself, did something to him he couldn't name. Later that night, after supper, she brought him a cup of coffee. "Thank you," he said quietly. She didn't reply, but she sat beside him, not touching, just close enough that he felt her presence in his ribs. "I used to hum," she said again. "I know," he said. She looked at him, and this time her eyes didn't drift away. I haven't in a long time. Maybe now, he said. You will. She didn't answer, but in the quiet that followed, she hummed again, soft, uncertain, brave. And Samuel, still as the hills, let it echo through him like a church bell in the middle of nowhere. The wind shifted late one afternoon, carrying the scent of dry grass and something sour beneath it, a kind of warning Samuel felt in his bones. He was mending the fence near the west paddock when he saw Eleanor coming toward him, her skirt tugged by the wind, hands wrapped over her belly. They're coming, she said quietly. He didn't ask how she knew. He just believed her. By sunset, the sky bruised purple and the fields turned to rust. The mule paced. Even the birds quieted. Samuel cleaned the rifle without hurry. Then he lit the lantern just as the knock came. 3 men stood at the edge of the porch. Same as before. One wore a wide-brimmed hat low over his brow. One chewed tobacco with slow arrogance. The third, Eleanor's brother-in-law, wore a grin like oil on water. Evening, Cridge, he said. Samuel didn't return the greeting. You're not welcome here. The man stepped forward. We just came to check on family. She's not yours to check on, Samuel replied, voice calm. She's carrying our kin, the man said, as if that made it holy. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, the other protectively over her belly. Her eyes didn't flicker. You told me I was a burden, she said flatly. You sold me. You have no right to be here. The brother-in-law ignored her, turned to Samuel. You think buying her makes her yours? There was no preacher, no paper. I married her yesterday morning, Samuel said evenly. Pastor Evans signed it. His wife witnessed. A pause. The man blinked. You're lying. Go check, Samuel said. Town clerk will confirm. Eleanor stepped down from the doorway. Her hand found Samuel's. I chose him, she said. That's what you never understood. You can't sell someone who doesn't belong to you. The other men shifted uncomfortably. The brother-in-law's mouth twisted, but his eyes darted, weighing what he stood to gain. He spit in the dirt. This ain't over, he growled. Maybe not, Samuel replied, but you won't get through me. They rode off eventually. Dust trailed them like shame. Samuel set the rifle aside, but his jaw stayed tight. Eleanor stood beside him on the porch, breathing hard but steady. You really married me? She asked, turning toward him. I did. You didn't ask. I was going to. A beat of silence. I would have said yes, she said softly. He turned to her. She smiled. A real one this time. Not cautious, not hidden. I still do. He exhaled, slow and full of something he hadn't felt in years. That night, they didn't speak much, but they sat on the porch swing together, her hand resting lightly over his. No vows were spoken, none were needed. What lived between them had already rooted itself too deep for words. The next morning, Eleanor rose early. She made coffee, folded a blanket, fed the mule. When Samuel came in from the yard, she handed him a warm tin cup and kissed his cheek without warning. Thank you, she whispered. He blinked. For what? For not walking away. Later, she went out to the old cottonwood tree behind the house, where his first wife, Miriam, was buried. Samuel followed silent. Eleanor knelt and placed a single flower on the earth. Not out of jealousy, she said, but gratitude. She gave you a good man, she added, glancing back at him. And I got the part of him that still knows how to stay. Samuel didn't speak, but when he reached for her hand, she didn't flinch. And that night, she sang. Not just a hum, a song, soft and full of breath, carrying through the cracks in the walls like a promise to everything still broken in both of them. It came in the dark, not thunderous, not loud, but slow and creeping, like a shadow learning to breathe. The scent reached Samuel first, long before the glow, smoke, acrid and hungry, crawling through the cracks in the night air. He was out of bed before the second breath. The barn. Eleanor sat upright in the bed, her hands clutched over her belly. Samuel? Stay inside, he said, already pulling on his boots, already reaching for the shotgun. But she followed him out the door, barefoot in her nightdress. the wind pulling at her braid. The barn was ablaze, flames licking the sky, clawing up the rafters. Sparks spat into the air like curses. The mule inside shrieked, panicked, the sound cutting through the night like a child's scream. Samuel didn't hesitate. He ran in. She screamed after him, her voice raw and terrified. "Samuel!" Inside, heat pressed against him like a fist. He threw his coat over his head, teeth grit, heart pounding. Smoke stung his eyes. He found the rope, slashed it with a knife, slapped the mule hard on the flank. It bolted out, shrieking into the open air, but a beam crashed behind him. The heat chased him like a beast. He stumbled, coughing, vision swimming, and then her hands. Eleanor caught him halfway to the porch, dragging the man who had carried her when she had nothing left. "You damn fool," she whispered, tears streaking through ash on her cheeks. Neighbors came. They brought buckets, blankets, whatever hands they had left from the hard season. Mrs. Dinger appeared with a loaf of bread and eyes wide with fear. The storekeeper's boy ran barefoot with a jug of water sloshing at his side. Someone whispered they'd seen a rider slip away into the trees not long before the blaze. No one said a name. No one needed to. Samuel sat on the porch, coughing soot, the front of his shirt scorched, knuckles burned raw. Eleanor sat beside him, shawl tight around her, one hand over his. The barn collapsed sometime before dawn. The sound wasn't explosive. It was soft, like something surrendering. The morning came gray and ash-covered. Smoke still curled from the wreckage. Crows circled but didn't land. The sky stretched wide and indifferent. Eleanor sat at the table, shoulders drawn tight, her tea untouched. "They want to break us," she said. Samuel poured water into a tin cup, placed it gently before her. "They won't." She looked up at him, searching his face, not for anger, but for something steadier. "I believe you," she said, and in her voice was something stronger than hope. Faith. 3 days passed. The barn was gone, but the land remained. The mule grazed close to the house now, twitchy but safe. Samuel set to rebuilding, not just because he had to, but because he needed to. She worked beside him, as much as her body would allow. She swept ashes. She stacked lumber. She hummed again, even when her voice cracked. At night, they lay side by side, not always touching, but never apart. And then, just before dawn on the fourth morning, the pain came. Eleanor gripped the bedpost, sweat beading her brow. Samuel didn't panic. He boiled cloth. He brought water. He called for Mrs. Dinger, who had delivered 3 of her own. The neighbor came running, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, eyes fierce with purpose. It was long. It was hard. But when the first cry came, high and furious and alive, Samuel staggered back like he'd been struck. A boy, tiny fists, dark hair, a mouth wide open like the world owed him something. Eleanor wept, not from pain, but from the fact that she was still here, still whole, and no longer alone. Samuel stepped outside into the morning light, the sun rising over blackened fields and new lumber. He looked to the sky and whispered the name. Not Miriam, not the woman buried beneath the cottonwood, but the one who had chosen to stay. Eleanor. The baby's name was Jonah. Eleanor whispered it for the first time 2 nights after his birth, when the cabin was still and the fire had burned down to embers. She held him in her arms, cheek pressed against the crown of his head, and said it like a secret she had finally earned the right to keep. Samuel didn't ask where the name came from. He only nodded, his hand resting on the edge of the cradle he'd built from the scraps that hadn't burned. The weeks that followed were quiet, but not idle. Samuel rebuilt the barn with help from neighbors who no longer whispered behind hands. People brought nails, lumber, extra feed. Someone left a basket of fresh bread on the porch without a note. The town was beginning to see her, not as a burden or a scandal or a girl who'd been sold, but as a woman with roots now and fire in her shoulders. Eleanor planted the tomatoes properly this time, rows neat and careful along the fence line. Lavender, too, though it struggled at first. She sang to it anyway. Jonah's cry was soft and steady. He didn't fuss often. When he did, she rocked him gently, her voice barely above a breath, like a prayer she no longer expected to be answered, only heard. One afternoon, Samuel returned from the field to find her sitting in the dirt, skirt hitched up, Jonah asleep in her lap. She was humming, ribbon in her hair, a small smile tucked in the corner of her mouth like a secret she didn't need to hide anymore. "I thought I'd die out here," she said when she noticed him. "You didn't," he replied, setting down his tools. "No," she said, looking down at her son. "I lived." And Samuel, who had buried a wife, buried a child, buried a version of himself that once believed the world would never be kind again, realized that this woman, this boy, this little homestead with a crooked porch and a sunburned fence was his family, not through blood, but through fire and choice. They held a second wedding in the fall, this time with rings, with neighbors, with music played off key and a pie so sweet it made people laugh through tears. Eleanor wore a dress the color of wheat and placed a single flower at the grave under the cottonwood. Not out of obligation, not out of sorrow, but gratitude. "Miriam gave you a good heart," she whispered, "and I get the part that still knows how to grow." Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the guests had gone home, she sat on the porch swing with Jonah asleep against her chest. Samuel sat beside her, one arm stretched along the back of the swing, his other hand resting gently on her knee. "You ever think it'd be like this?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "Didn't think I'd make it this far." "Me neither." She turned her head toward him. "Do you believe in blessings?" "I'm starting to." She smiled, wide this time, unguarded. "You're not a man of many words," she said. "No need to be," he replied. "You've said enough for the both of us." She laughed softly, and in that laugh, in that porch swing under the stars, in the cradle nearby, and the crops that hadn't died, and the walls they'd built together, Samuel Cridge saw something he'd long forgotten how to recognize: home. Autumn fell quiet across the land. The tomatoes ripened in neat rows. The lavender finally bloomed, small purple bursts against dry soil that had once known only ash. Wind moved slower now, as if even it had learned to be gentle. Eleanor rose early each morning, not from fear or habit, but from the rhythm of a life she had chosen. She wrapped Jonah to her chest and walked the fence line, whispering to the plants, humming to the sky. Sometimes she paused by the cottonwood tree and stood there with no words, only breath. Samuel watched her from the porch with a coffee in hand, the steam curling around a face that had softened in the quiet seasons. He didn't speak much still, but she no longer needed him to. His silence wasn't a wall, it was a shelter. Jonah grew, slowly, surely. He had Samuel's eyes and Eleanor's quiet fire. He was a stubborn sleeper, a strong kicker, and most days he looked around like he was trying to memorize everything he'd come into too late. Neighbors came more often now, to visit, to help, to listen. No one talked about the auction. No one mentioned the fire. They talked instead about Eleanor's bread, about Jonah's laugh, about how Samuel Cridge smiled now, not often, but enough that folks noticed. One afternoon, Eleanor returned from town with cloth for new shirts and a small tin of lavender soap. She stepped onto the porch to find Samuel sanding a piece of wood. "What are you making?" she asked. He glanced up. "A chair." "For who?" He hesitated. Then, "For you. You always sit on the step." She blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. Not the chair, but the way he had watched her closely enough to notice and then quietly done something about it. She reached for his hand, calloused, warm. "You're good to me," she said. "You let me be." That night, after Jonah was asleep, they sat on that new chair together, her in his lap, his hand resting against her back like a memory he never wanted to lose. "Do you think they'll come again?" she asked. "They already did," he said. She looked at him. "And we didn't break," he added. Winter came without fury that year. The roof held, the barn stood, the stove crackled, and the nights, once terrifying, once long, became something else entirely. Eleanor would hum while rocking Jonah. Samuel would listen, whittling by the fire, carving shapes into things that didn't need fixing, only softening. And in those small hours, between the flickers of flame and the gentle weight of breath, they stitched a life, not perfect, but whole. On Jonah's first birthday, they buried a time box beneath the cottonwood tree. Inside, a ribbon, a tiny shirt Eleanor had sewn by hand, A photograph Mrs. Dinger had taken of the three of them, whined in their hair and soot still visible on the porch rail, and a single sentence on paper in Eleanor's careful hand. We survived, and we chose each other. They buried it without ceremony, just dirt and laughter and the sound of Jonah babbling into the breeze. Years later, long after the scars of fire had faded into memory, folks in Cold Creek would still speak of Eleanor Dumont, the woman once sold who became matriarch of the Ridge. They'd mention how Samuel Cridge built her a chair without asking, how he never raised his voice but always stood his ground. Some said their story was strange, others said it was holy. But those who knew, truly knew, said it was simply this, a story about staying, about fire that didn't consume, about silence that healed, about a girl who once had no voice and a man who gave her space enough to find it again. And in that wild stretch of land where wind whispered through lavender and fence posts, creaked in the evening sun, you could still sometimes hear the hum of a woman who was never truly broken, only waiting to bloom. Years passed, not loud, but steady. The land changed, so did they. Winters grew shorter, summers longer. The trees that once stood bare now shaded the porch where Eleanor rocked Jonah, now a boy with grass-stained knees and a voice full of questions. He ran barefoot, climbed fence posts, named the chickens. When he laughed, it was sunlight. When he cried, it was brief, like thunder before rain. Samuel taught him to hammer nails and count clouds. Eleanor taught him to listen before he spoke. One afternoon, Jonah brought her a rock shaped like a heart and said, "This is for you, Mama, so you don't forget I love you." She cried, quietly but deeply, not because she doubted his love, but because for so long she'd believed she would never hear someone call her Mama with that kind of certainty. Samuel had grown more weathered, his hair silvered, his hands stiffened, but he moved with the same calm strength, like the bones of the land itself. Every day he touched something that had once burned, the barn door, the porch swing, the beams above Jonah's bed, not to mourn it, but to remember that it still stood. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit on the porch with Eleanor after Jonah had fallen asleep and say nothing at all, and that silence was no longer a distance. It was their language. He had given her space when she needed it, and now she filled that space with belonging. Eleanor had changed too. She laughed more, and with her mouth, not just her eyes. She no longer flinched at footsteps behind her. She no longer expected kindness to come with conditions. She planted new crops each spring, carrots, beans, mint for tea. She stitched new clothes and mended old wounds. The lavender she once thought would die bloomed taller than the fence now, and when town folks came, they didn't whisper anymore. They asked her how to make her cornbread. They asked her what she'd done to calm Samuel's mule, who now bowed his head gently when she passed. They called her Mrs. Cridge. She didn't correct them. One foggy morning, Jonah asked where he came from. Eleanor knelt in the garden, dirt on her hands, and looked into her boy's wide, serious eyes. "You came from a place that was broken," she said honestly. "But you were never broken." He frowned. "Like the barn?" She smiled. "Yes, like the barn." Jonah looked toward it, toward the beams and boards Samuel had rebuilt with ash still clinging to the corners. "But it's strong now." "It is," she said, "because someone stayed." Later that day, she found Jonah digging near the cottonwood tree. At first, panic surged, old, buried panic that something sacred was being disturbed, but when she reached him, she saw the small wooden box in his hands, the time box. "I wanted to see if the ribbon was still there," he said. She nodded. Together they opened it. Inside, the blue ribbon, faded but intact, the baby shirt, the photograph, the sentence on paper, "We survived, and we chose each other." Jonah ran his fingers over the words. "Who wrote this?" "I did," Eleanor said, "a long time ago." He looked at her like she was a story he hadn't heard yet. "Can I add something?" She handed him a pencil. He added one more line beneath her handwriting. "And I was the reason they kept going." Her breath caught. She didn't stop him, didn't correct him, because maybe he was right. That night, they buried the box again, but deeper, not to forget, but to give it roots. And as the stars blinked awake and Samuel carried Jonah inside, Eleanor stood at the edge of the porch, hand resting on her belly again, not from fear, but memory. She wasn't running anymore. She was growing, and the land, that old, scorched, silent land, remembered everything and welcomed it all. The porch had aged. The wood groaned beneath every step now, but it held. So did the house, the barn, and the cottonwood tree that towered behind the fence line like a sentinel of memory. Its roots ran deep, tangled in time and rain, and whispered prayers. Eleanor sat in her old chair, worn smooth by years of use, Jonah's quilt over her knees, a shawl across her shoulders. The sun stretched across the hills, spilling golden light onto the earth like a benediction. Samuel wasn't beside her today, not because he'd left. Samuel Cridge was not the leaving kind, but because the years had finally asked for his rest. He'd passed the winter before, quiet as always, fingers wrapped around hers, as if even in death he intended to stay steady. "I'll still be here," he had told her that final night, voice cracked like old wood. "You just keep the porch warm." So she did. Every morning she opened the door, brewed the coffee, swept the steps. Not from habit, but from love. Jonah had grown into a man. He lived just past the ridge now, in a house he built with his own hands, not far from where he took his first steps. He visited daily, sometimes with his own boy in tow, a curly-haired child with a loud laugh and a habit of asking questions just like his father once had. "Tell me again about the ribbon," the boy would say, and Eleanor would smile, patting the soft spot beside her. It was blue, and it meant, "I belong to myself." The boy would blink at that. "But weren't you Mama's first?" "I was no one's," she would reply, "until I chose who I wanted to be." And the boy, not quite understanding, would nod as if he did anyway. One afternoon, Jonah found her humming, not sewing, not rocking, just sitting, eyes closed, her voice floating soft and aimless into the wind. He didn't speak, just sat beside her. She opened her eyes slowly. "Do you remember the fire?" she asked. He nodded. "I don't remember the flames, but I remember your voice. You were singing. Later, after." "I needed to hear something alive," she whispered. Jonah reached for her hand. "You were," he said. When she passed, it was spring again. The lavender was blooming. The tomatoes had just broken through the soil. She went peacefully, not in a bed, but on that porch, hands folded over her lap, a hum still lingering in her throat like she'd fallen asleep between verses. Jonah buried her beneath the cottonwood, next to Samuel. He placed a jar of lavender on her grave and the time box beside it, this time with a new note inside written in a boy's hand. She didn't just survive, she gave us all something to stand on. Years later, when strangers passed through Cold Creek, they'd sometimes hear whispers in town of the woman who once stood up and said, "I don't belong to you." They'd hear about the fire, about the man who bought her freedom without asking for anything in return, about the porch swing, about the blue ribbon, and always about the quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the kind that heals, the kind that listens, the kind that sings in the wind if you sit still long enough to hear it. Because somewhere beyond the fence, where the cottonwood bends with age and lavender grows wild across the grave, the land still remembers Eleanor Dumont, not as the girl who was sold, but as the woman who stayed and grew and gave